Direct the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. I've been thinking and writing about nuclear war and nuclear issues for several decades now. In 1995, I began the Nuclear Studies Institute. That was the 50th anniversary of the atomic bombings. And one of my students, whose grandfather was killed in Hiroshima, and her mother and grandmother survived the bombing, she and I decided we were going to do something major to commemorate the 50th anniversary. And we were going to teach classes at American University, as well as bring students to Hiroshima and Kyoto to commemorate the events. While we were planning that, the Smithsonian canceled the Enola Gay exhibit. So the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki asked if we would bring some of the artifacts that were supposed to go to the Smithsonian to American University. And that's how we kicked off my Nuclear Studies Institute, with the first exhibit that Hiroshima and Nagasaki ever did outside of Japan in 1995. We did a second exhibit in 2015, which was even a bigger one. Then, I guess what else I should say is that a decade ago, Oliver Stone, the filmmaker, and I did a 12-part, 12-hour documentary film series and a series of books titled The Untold History of the United States, and which revolves quite a bit around nuclear history. Now, that's enough about me for starters, but I want to say that the book that this movie is based on was written by two close friends of mine, Martin Sherwin and Kai Bird. The book is American Prometheus. I hope some of you have read it. It's a terrific book. I think it was published in 2005, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, which it definitely deserved. Now, other filmmakers before Christopher Nolan had taken a crack at this. Some pretty renowned filmmakers had actually commissioned it or thought about it, and including my friend Oliver Stone. Oliver knew Marty and Kai. We've had numerous dinners with them over the years. And Oliver looked at the book and said he couldn't figure out how to do it. Said it was too complicated. But when he saw the Nolan film, he wrote to me and issued publicly a statement that Christopher Nolan did it brilliantly, that he figured out how to do it in a way that really captured the book and Oppenheimer in all of his complexity and introduced a lot of very important history. Now, Oliver took issue with some of the points of historical interpretation or some of the things that were not included in the movie. But in Oliver's mind, that did not diminish its importance or its impact. And I agree with Oliver about that. So I want to start off by talking about some of the things that I really like about this movie before we get into the criticism. It's a compelling 3-hour movie that was filled with dialogue and information and history. And I've spoken to lots of people who have seen this. I've given a lot of talks and interviews about it, and I haven't heard anyone say it was boring. Everybody I've spoken to says that they really love the movie, especially those who are not experts in nuclear history. So I think that that's much to its credit, that Nolan was able to do that, and he was able to do it in a compelling way, in a way that was visually arresting, and that was highly educational. People who don't know the history learned a lot from this movie, most of which is quite accurate and much of which is true to the book. But it's, I think, a 700-page book. And how do you get 700 pages even into a 3-hour Hollywood movie? But for a Hollywood blockbuster, And we've seen the other films that have been done, or some of you have seen them. Beginning in 1947, the MGM movie, The Beginning or the End. And then a few years later, a movie about Captain Paul Tibbets, Above and Beyond. Or more recently, the movie Truman, based on David McCullough. I'm not a big fan of David McCullough's history or his treatment of Truman, and that completely distorts a lot of this history. Or the movie Fat Man and Little Boy, in which Paul Newman plays Leslie Groves and steals the movie from Dwight Schultz. It was intended as an anti-nuclear movie, but in the end, you can hardly tell that because of Leslie Groves' domination of Robert Oppenheimer. And right before this, MSNBC came out with a documentary about this title, To End All Wars, Oppenheimer and the Atomic Bomb. I don't know if any of you saw that, but it's terrible. It's a complete distortion of history. It's real myth making. And so Nolan, to his credit, largely avoids that. And I think the directing is brilliant. I think the acting is excellent. The editing, the cinematography, everything about this film from a filmmaking standpoint, I found to be first rate. The Ann Hornaday, one of my favorite reviewers for the Washington Post, who has interviewed Oliver and me a couple of times, talked about the Oppenheimer character. And she says, the tragic figure at the movie's core, Oppenheimer, brought to fascinatingly paradoxical life by Cillian Murphy. And I thought that he did a very, very good job. Now, Matt Damon's presentation of Leslie Groves, that's the warmest and fuzziest and most likable portrayal of Leslie Groves that one is ever going to see. In most Hollywood movies, Leslie Groves is meant to be the villain. Here, it's like a buddy movie. He and Oppenheimer are friends, and they work together to build the bomb. Who was Leslie Groves in reality? He and Oppenheimer were polar opposites in every way. Groves was a big, fat, 250, 300-pound bully. Oppenheimer starts off the Manhattan Project he's about 6 feet tall. He weighs 125 pounds. By the end of the project, he's down to below 115 pounds. They were opposites. Groves didn't drink. He was a teetotaler. Oppenheimer drank like a fish. Groves was politically conservative. Oppenheimer was effectively a communist. In fact, I think they downplay Oppenheimer's politics when in discussing the 1930s and early 40s. Oppenheimer said he was a member of every left-wing front group on the West Coast. He gave 1/10 of his salary every month to the Communist Party to support the Republican cause in Spain. His girlfriend, Jean Tatlock, who's played by Florence Pugh, was a member of the Communist Party. His wife, Kitty, was a member of the Communist Party. Her ex-husband, one of her ex-husbands, had been killed in Spain fighting for the Republic. His brother and his brother's wife were members of the Communist Party. Almost all of his graduate students were members of the Communist Party. So if Oppenheimer was not a card-carrying member, it was because he didn't need to be. He went to the meetings, he gave the money, he effectively mouthed the communist line, he'd read all of Marx and Lenin and Engels. He really was, in every way, we don't know if he was a card-carrying member, but he was in spirit and his heart a member of the Communist Party. And I think that it even gets downplayed a little bit in the movie. But Leslie Groves, who was the opposite, and Leslie Groves also was working in the field at an early age. Oppenheimer came from this totally pampered background with French maids, with paintings on the wall by Van Gogh and Cézanne, Matisse, apartments on the Upper East Side, vacationing, another home on Long Island, vacationing in Europe, his own yacht, his own ponies, totally pampered. Leslie Groves came from a hard scrabble background, but Leslie Groves was very mean-spirited. He was not Matt Damon. Leslie Groves, his assistant, said Groves was he was the biggest son of a bitch I ever met. I hated his guts, and so did everybody else. You wouldn't know that. And the tension between the scientists on the one hand and the military was palpable. In fact, they gave them all nicknames to use, and they wanted compartmentalization. Oppenheimer insisted that the people who had or had college degrees should be allowed to meet and discuss the ideas. In some ways, the film downplays the way in which this was a collaborative effort on the part of the scientists. But one time, Groves comes into Oppenheimer's office and says to Oppenheimer, I don't want you wearing that pork pie hat anymore. It makes you too identifiable. Oppenheimer says, okay. And the next time Groves comes in, Oppenheimer's wearing a full Indian headdress. And he says, I'm going to wear this till the end of the war. So, there's a lot of tension between the scientists and the military. And one of them found a hole in the barbed wire fencing and would go out through the hole and walk in through the front gate past the guards and wave to them every time. So the scientists were always doing what they could to antagonize the military. And some of that does not come across either. The film also does a very good job in capturing the intellectual excitement of the 1920s. You've got Oppenheimer and the scientific revolution, the quantum revolution. They're going and studying in Cambridge, in Leiden, in Göttingen, with the great scientists of the world. They capture that excitement. And also the modernism, Stravinsky and Picasso and T.S. Eliot and that world. It was actually much more vibrant than I think the film captures, but at least it makes some attempt to do so, to its credit. The film also showcases the McCarthyite red baiting. You might say that McCarthy's an easy target. Now everybody, other than Donald Trump and his friend Roy Cohn, and even the Republicans now condemn McCarthyism. So it's an easy target, but it does a good job of it and shows the dangers of red baiting, shows the sickness of that kind of anti-communism in the 50s. And it comes at an important time because we're going through that again. We're going through red baiting again. Anybody who's critical of the U.S. unlimited military support for Ukraine now is being red baited as a Putin, apologist, as being soft. So that's coming back again. I think it's important to remind the public of how ugly that destructive that was. And the film focuses in large part on the 1954 hearing, which is shown in color. And that's the security hearing, which Oppenheimer loses security clearance. And then it shows the 1959 hearing in which Louis Strauss, who's the bad guy in this movie instead of Groves, Louis Strauss, who starts off as an itinerant shoe salesman, ends up being an investment banker, then becomes the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. Strauss was a vicious anti-communist and red baiter, and he's the one who goes after Oppenheimer, and along with William Borden, and they take away Oppenheimer's security clearance. And so I think the fact that it shows that is very, very important, and I give it a lot of credit for that. And I think that is also very timely now. One of the things that it does very well is it shows Oppenheimer as a complicated and tormented character. Marty and Kai do a very good job of that in the biography. But the fact that Nolan does that, I think, is quite effective. And it shows his youth. It shows him when he gets criticized by the British later Nobel Prize winning physicist P.M.S. Blackett for his lousy laboratory techniques, injecting cyanide into the apple. And then that scene there, they show Oppenheimer rushing back and rescuing Niels Bohr from eating the apple. Niels Bohr wasn't involved in that. I don't know why they put that one in there, but it was still, and it shows Oppenheimer tried to strangle his friend when his friend said that he was in love and wanted to get married. And Oppenheimer had suicidal tendencies and struggled with bouts of depression and was always very, very conflicted. And I think the film shows that well also. Uh, Martin Jones wrote a review of the book American Prometheus in 2005 in Newsweek. And he said, Oppenheimer's life does not influence us, it haunts us. And I think the film captures that in some real sense, that it shows Oppenheimer as a tormented figure, as an anguished figure, as somebody who felt a lot of guilt over his involvement in the bomb project. And the thing about Oppenheimer is that he succeeds where he should have failed. And, he uses his charisma, his brilliance, his personality, his talent to help create the bomb. Unfortunately, that's his crowning achievement. Whereas he later starts to feel some qualms about that. And the movie shows that. And I think in some ways the movie probably exaggerates that. Shows Oppenheimer as more tormented over what he did and what he failed to achieve later. Christopher Nolan made some interesting comments. He was later asked, wrote in his production notes, he said, like it or not, J. Robert Oppenheimer is the most important person who ever lived. I don't know if that makes Leslie Groves the second most important person who ever lived, or Edward Teller, but that's what Nolan felt. And when he was asked to explain, he said in an interview, in Hollywood, we're not afraid of a little hype. Do I genuinely believe it? Absolutely. Because if my worst fears are true, he'll be the man who destroyed the world. Who's more important than that? He gave the world the power to destroy itself. No one has done that before. So that was the vision that Nolan took into this film. This idea that Oppenheimer was the most important man who ever lived because he made possible the atomic bomb, which holds out the possibility that the world can destroy itself, which we grapple with. And it has a really brilliant ending there, which I appreciate. It's totally apocryphal from what I know. But he has Einstein and Oppenheimer, and they show that scene several times, but they don't really explain it till the very end. And they say back and forth that maybe they did succeed in destroying the world. And that's something we can't know, but we can all do our best to make sure it doesn't happen. But also, to the film's credit, it shows this conflicted Oppenheimer. My friend Robert J. Lifton wrote, Oppenheimer's greatest tragedy was the success of his leadership in the creation of the weapon. His remarkable gifts as physicist, as a human being, were most realized in the building of a weapon that could lead to the destruction of humankind. Oppenheimer himself says, in some sort of crude sense which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin. And this is a knowledge which they cannot lose. So I think that a lot of that comes across. But Einstein commented that he thought that Oppenheimer subjecting himself to that kangaroo court, that security hearing, was not only a mistake, but he said in Yiddish, Oppenheimer is a nar. He said Oppenheimer is a fool for subjecting himself in that way to that security hearing in a way that he could not win. The film shows him, and has Kitty comment, that no matter, even if you let them tar and feather you, you're never going to be able to overcome your guilt. So maybe that's part of what it was. But in any case, perhaps the film's greatest achievement is that it sparked a very needed discussion of nuclear war and nuclear weapons. We haven't had that discussion in a real public way in this country since the 1980s. We haven't had it since Reykjavik, really. We had it in 1982 at the March in Central Park. We had it in the debates in the 1980s. We had it in The Day After and Threads and Testament and those movies that came out. But we haven't had it for more than 4 decades, or for 4 decades. And this film has triggered it. And I give it a lot of credit. Other things have also led to that awareness again. We've got Putin's nuclear saber rattling. We've got the tragic death of my dear friend, Dan Ellsberg, who was in many ways America's conscience when it came to nuclear weapons. We've had it with the 60th anniversary recently of the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which triggered a lot of discussion. We've had it very recently with the 60th anniversary of Jack Kennedy's commencement address at American University, which I think was the most important presidential address of the 20th century. So there's been other things that have contributed, but this movie has sparked more of a discussion than anything else. And Nolan said, when I first started writing Oppenheimer, I remember clearly a conversation I had with one of my teenage sons, where I told him that I was working on what I was working on. And he literally said to me, well, nobody really worries about nuclear weapons anymore. Are people going to be interested in that? And there's a lot of truth to that, sadly. You might take my students. They're very concerned about climate change as an existential threat. They're extremely knowledgeable about that. They're very knowledgeable and sensitive to gender issues, to racial issues. But when it comes to nuclear war, unlike the students a couple decades ago, they are not really concerned. And they say, well, we've had this threat, we've lived with this threat for 78 years, and it hasn't happened. So it's not going to happen now. Well, sadly, they're wrong. Sadly, that reality exists. Sadly, there's good reason why the bulletin of atomic scientists has moved the hands of the doomsday clock to 2 minutes before midnight in 2017, after we almost went to war over Korea, then to 90 seconds before midnight in 2020, and this year to 100 seconds before midnight in 2020 and 90 seconds before midnight this year. I would move it a lot closer. The danger over Ukraine, the possibility of war with China, over Taiwan, things we can talk about, have really made that danger greater than ever. But what are the film's deficiencies? What do I write about? Back in 2020, Marty Sherwin, Kai Bird, Gar Alpovitz, and I just did a series of international press briefings and webinars and wrote an op-ed together in the LA Times, trying to preempt the discussion about the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings, because we knew that the media, left to its own devices, would portray the atomic bombs as necessary. And here's the big myth that I find most objectionable. The idea that the atomic bombs were not only necessary, they were actually moral. And it's come out again. Dennis Overby, the New York Times physics and astronomy reporter, wrote an article about the Oppenheimer movie in the New York Times, and he said, the subsequent bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war against Japan in 1945. That myth, the fundamental lie at the heart of the American empire, the heart of American exceptionalism, that the atomic bombs were not only necessary, that they were actually moral, because the only alternative was a US invasion, in which, according to Truman in his memoir, 500,000 Americans would be killed in the invasion, as would millions of Japanese. So the atomic bombs were not only necessary, they were moral. They saved lives. It was good that we did it. Now that view was not only expressed by Dennis Overby, it's expressed by Obama, When Obama went to Hiroshima in May of 2016, I was brought over there to do commentary by Japan Public Television, NHK. And if you remember Obama's comments there, I had urged Obama to go from the day he got elected. I was glad that he went. The only previous president who went was Jimmy Carter, but that was after he was out of office. So it was right that Obama should go. But what he said there was terrible. He says this opens by saying, on a bright sunny sky in 1945, death fell from the skies. Well, death didn't fall from the skies. The United States dropped an atomic bomb, and then 3 days later dropped another atomic bomb. But when he goes on to say the crucial lie, he says, World War II reached its brutal end in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nonsense. But we get that Susan Rice, former national security advisor, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times in 2019. And she says, following D-Day, my father was sent to the West Coast to prepare for deployment to the Pacific Theater. He was spared combat by President Harry Truman's decision to drop atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, provoking the Japanese surrender. We get that in Mike Wallace's award-winning book in 2020. We get that over and over again, this lie that the atomic bombs ended the war. Well, actually, you know, there is some truth, not to that. But if you go to the U.S. Navy Museum in Washington, D.C., the official museum, they say now the vast destruction wreaked by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the loss of 135,000 people made little impact on the Japanese military. However, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria changed their minds. We know this. We know this from the Strategic Bombing Survey. We know this from the War Department report. We know that 7 of America's 8 five-star admirals and generals in 1945 are on record saying the atomic bombs were either militarily unnecessary, morally reprehensible, or both. We know that Admiral Leahy, who chaired the meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and was Truman's personal chief of staff, said that the atomic bombings of a thoroughly defeated Japan put us on the moral level of the barbarians of the Dark Ages. He said we went on to kill as many women and children as we could, which is what we wanted to do all along. We know that Eisenhower was opposed to it. MacArthur, who wanted to use atomic bombs in Korea, MacArthur says we could have ended the war in May if we had told the Japanese they could keep the emperor. We knew that the Soviet invasion, the United States had been urging Stalin to come into the Pacific War since the day after Pearl Harbor. But Stalin was fighting the Germans, right? Most Americans don't know, but you guys probably do, that throughout most of the war, World War II, the Soviets were fighting over 200 German divisions, while the US and the British were fighting 10 between us. And there's a reason why the Soviets lost 27 million. There's a reason why Churchill said the Red Army tore the guts out of the Nazi war machine. But there's also a reason why most Americans believe that the US won the war in Europe, not the Soviets. And so, but at Yalta in February, Stalin agreed to come into the Pacific War 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, which means August 8th or August 9th. Exactly when the Soviets did come in. And American intelligence started saying back in April, the Joint Intelligence Committees, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that the Soviet entry into the war will convince all Japanese that continued resistance is futile. Said on several occasions that the Soviet entry will end the war. We knew that. Intelligence knew that. The military knew that. Truman knew that. Truman goes to Potsdam, has lunch with Stalin on July 17th. He goes back and writes in his diary, Stalin will be in the Jap war by August 15th. Finny Japs when that occurs. He writes home to his wife Bess the next day. The Russians are coming in. We'll end the war a year sooner now. Think of all the kids who won't be killed. Truman also knew that the other way to speed up Japanese surrender was to change the surrender terms let the Japanese know they could keep the emperor, who they considered to be a divine being. Truman refers to says of the intercepted July 18th telegram, calls it the telegram from the Jap emperor asking for peace. The question for historians is not whether we had to use the bomb to avoid an invasion. There was no chance, as Eisenhower says, we were going to have to invade. The question was why we used it and who was the real target. And that's what the film doesn't go into. In fact, as the Kremlin interpreted, the Soviets knew better than anybody how desperate the Japanese were to surrender. Because in mid-May, the Japanese War Cabinet decided that the best chance for getting better surrender terms was to try to get the Soviets to intervene on their behalf to get them better surrender terms. So in early June, former Japanese Prime Minister Hirota meets with the Soviet ambassador in Tokyo, Malik, on several occasions. Malik writes back to the Kremlin, the Japanese are desperate to surrender. Stalin knew this better than anybody, in addition to the spies that he had in the Manhattan Project. So he knew what was going on. And when the US dropped the atomic bombs, the Soviet leaders interpreted it as if they were the target, not Japan. And this was a very big factor in speeding up and catalyzing the Cold War, as the Soviets knew that they were engaged in a struggle. But the scientists also knew that. And in fact, the Frank Committee at MetLab in Chicago issued a report in June saying that even if we have the bomb, we shouldn't use it because it's going to lead to an uncontrollable arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union that could lead to mutual destruction. So, and the spokesperson for the movie who says that is Leo Szilard. Now, this is a movie that spends 45 minutes building up to and showing the Trinity test in Alamogordo. It spends 45 seconds discussing the scientists' opposition to using the bomb. And in fact, it has Oppenheimer refuting them and saying, what we have to do is not pass this petition around. And he urges them not to sign the petition, and he blocks its circulation. But he also says that what we have to do is use the bomb to end the war. That's the lie that the movie develops. And then it has a very important meeting of the interim committee on May 31st. The real topic in that meeting was how do we inform the Soviets of our use of the bomb so we don't lead to an arms race. That gets papered over. The dialogue is hard to understand. It goes by so quickly that even I, who know that whole thing and have read it, could hardly follow it. And then they have Stimson, after saying that he honeymooned in Kyoto, so they shouldn't drop the bomb on Kyoto. Then he says that the Japanese are fanatics. The only way to get them to surrender is to wipe out their cities. That was Stimson's position, was actually much more complicated. But the message of the movie is that the bomb was necessary to avoid an invasion, which would have killed 500,000 American soldiers, as well as millions of Japanese, and was therefore moral. Nolan does raise the opposition on three separate occasions, but it goes by so fast and so incomprehensibly that I think anybody watching it would have missed it, and gives the final word to Oppenheimer and the defenders of the atomic bomb. I don't know how long I've spent, but I'm probably running out of time. So let me
go ahead, Peter. This is fascinating.
One other thing that Oppenheimer says, one of the other things that I think is terrific about the movie is from the very beginning, it mentions Teller's obsession with the thermonuclear bomb, with the super bomb, which Teller wanted to focus on as early as 1942. So Oppenheimer was asked by Arthur Holly Compton at MetLab in Chicago to organize a group of what he called the luminaries, the most brilliant scientists, to go out to Berkeley and to think about the implications of the bomb. And when they're doing that, they put up equations that make them realize that the igniting an atomic bomb could ignite all of the nitrogen in the atmosphere or all of the hydrogen in the oceans and blow up the world. In the movie, Oppenheimer goes and discusses it with Einstein. That's a fabrication. In reality, they stop the project. Oppenheimer rushes out to northern Michigan, where Arthur Holly Compton was vacationing, and tells Compton about this. And Compton's response, which the movie doesn't have, is brilliant. He says, "It is better to live in slavery to the Nazis than to bring down the final curtain on mankind." And that's the moral judgment that the movie needed to make, and that Nolan does understand. But then Oppenheimer goes back. They halt the project. Oppenheimer goes back to Berkeley. Beta and Teller do more calculations, and they decide that the chance of blowing up the world is 3 in a million. And they decide, well, those are good enough odds, and so let's go ahead with the project. But even when they do the Trinity test, some of the scientists are so terrified by the fireball, the explosion, the magnitude of it, that they thought they did ignite the atmosphere and that the world was over. So that's what they were dealing with. But at that May 31st meeting, one of the military leaders, one of the political leaders, asked Oppenheimer, what's coming down the pike? And Oppenheimer says that within 3 years, we're likely to have weapons between 700 and 7,000 times as powerful as the bomb that destroys Hiroshima. So we knew what was coming. We knew that the world that we created. When Truman is at Potsdam on July 25th of 45, and he gets the full briefing on how powerful the bomb test was, he writes in his diary, "We've discovered the most terrible bomb in history. This may be the fire of destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark." Truman decided to use the bomb and gave the order to do so, despite the fact that he knew and said on 3 separate occasions that he understood he was beginning a process that could end life on the planet. And he used the bomb in exactly the way that he was warned would most likely trigger the nuclear arms race with the Soviets that could do so. And he does. And we're very lucky to have survived up to this point. But to think of the insanity, there was Project Sundial. And in 1954, we actually had congressional hearings that were testified, in which leading scientists testified about the prospects of building a single bomb that would be 750,000 times as powerful as the bomb that destroys Hiroshima. That's the madness. That's the madness that Dan Ellsberg tried so hard to convey, and that we're still living with today. But the movie does raise that to some extent, and the movie does get this discussion going. But a couple other things that we need to mention. Before the movie was made, the group in Los Alamos of atomic bomb survivors begged Nolan to show the first victims of the atomic bomb. That was the 500,000 people in New Mexico and surrounding regions who were affected by the bomb. The scientists warned Groves and Oppenheimer beforehand that the bomb's radioactivity and fallout was going to make an area 40 square miles uninhabitable and could contaminate the people living in that area. The Trinity test was terrifying. The mushroom cloud was 7 miles high. It affected an area 150 miles. There were 500,000 people within that range. The fallout fell for days. People played in it. They ate it. They didn't know what it was. They decided not to warn people. Then they put out cover stories. And even after the war ended, they decided to lie to the people in New Mexico and Texas and Arizona who were victims of it. In fact, the fallout ended up falling in 46 states and a few countries. So this was, but they decided not to do that. in the movie. They could have done it. Even a sentence or two. They didn't want to how to add more. They could have added a couple sentences warning Groves and Oppenheimer about the fallout, which they understood and took precautions against the scientists without taking up much more time or adding a lot more complexity. But they chose not to do that, and that was a mistake. The other thing, I just did an interview a couple of days ago with Mainichi Shimbun, the important Japanese newspaper. And as you might know, there's a lot of controversy in Japan because the Japanese victims are not shown. And the movie is not opened in Japan, partly for that reason, because of Japanese criticism of it. Now, that's a more difficult question because it does show in Oppenheimer's mind, after the scientists are cheering when they get the news about Hiroshima being wiped out, and Truman's comment aboard the USS Augusta, and he says, this is the greatest thing in history when he found that Hiroshima had been wiped off the map. And the scientists are cheering and calling out Oppenheimer's name, and Oppenheimer goes up there and is saying all these, great things about how great it was that we succeeded in the bomb project. But then they show what he's thinking, and they show that he's imagining his audience being incinerated and vaporized and carbonized, and these images that they put in Oppenheimer's mind. But the reality is they show no images of people in Japan, which to the Japanese is unacceptable. It's a complicated question in a 3-hour movie. You can't do this in a way that trivializes it. You can't do it quickly. Could they have done more about the victims? Yes. But even the screenplay I wrote for Oliver Stone about somebody who was truly a hero in American history, Henry Wallace, who gets left out of this movie. I was glad to see how negatively Harry Truman is portrayed. But there's a lot of history that Americans don't know. That Harry Truman should never have been president. That Harry Truman, that America's vice president between 1941 and 45 was Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was in many ways a visionary. Henry Wallace was the second most popular man in America, but the party bosses wanted him off the ticket. Gallup released a poll of potential voters on the day that the Democratic Party convention opened on July 20th, 1944, asking them who they wanted on the ticket as vice president, potential voters. 65% say wanted Wallace back as vice president. 2% said they wanted Truman. How the F did Truman become the vice president and then take over when Roosevelt dies on April 12th, 1945, instead of Wallace? It's a very important story that Americans don't know. And we could do, if you have questions, I'd love to tell that story. But had Wallace become president, or had Roosevelt lived longer, there would have been probably no atomic bombings in Roosevelt's case, certainly in Wallace's case in 1945, and very likely no Cold War. But you can't do that. But even in the script Oliver and I did, we couldn't really do Hiroshima because I guess my script was 4 hours or 5 hours. But, it's very hard to do that. But they could have done a lot more about the victims. They don't even bring Nagasaki in till an afterthought toward the end of the movie. So that's also some of the deficiencies. There's more we can say, but I don't want to take up all the time because I know you guys have your own thoughts and lots of questions. And I'm still formulating my ideas about this because, this is my friend Kai Bird has seen the movie 5 times. And he said that every time he watches it, he learns more. He understands more of the dialogue that he missed, and he picks up layers of nuance that he missed. I only saw it once, and I really need to see it a couple more times to get it in all of its complexity. But I think those are a lot of the important issues that to throw out there that we can talk about the film's strengths and its weaknesses and the opportunity it gives us in order to educate people about nuclear history and nuclear war and the insane dangers that we live with today on an ongoing basis as we're fighting now a new two-front Cold War, different from the first Cold War, but equally insane and equally dangerous.
Thank you, Peter. That was really a brilliant and insightful historical overview that we appreciate very much, and we look forward to sharing that with others. And I should mention before we move on that Peter will also be presenting at the Veterans for Peace National Convention next week, specifically on Saturday afternoon, the 26th. He'll be part of a panel on basically on U.S. war preparations in the Pacific aimed at China and North Korea. He'll be on a panel with K.J. No and Simone Chun, facilitated by Ann Wright. And I know it's going to be a very powerful panel. Of course, that build up in the Pacific also very much threatens nuclear war. I'm sure Peter will be addressing that. And that's another strong reason to register for the Veterans for Peace National Convention and join us next weekend. It's online, and it's 3 days this year, Friday the 25th through Sunday the 27th, and you can go right to the veteransforpeace.org website to register and find out more about that convention.